All right. So lifting as we climb, onward and upward we go, struggling and striving and hoping that the buds and blossoms of our desires will burst forth into glorious fruition ere long. Lifting as we climb, used in this quote by Mary Church Terrell, would become the slogan for the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. This sentiment communicates the reality of their position at the bottom rung of the socioeconomic ladder. As Mary Burnett Talbert puts it, with us as colored women, this struggle becomes twofold. First, because we are women, and second, because we are colored women. But it also belies their determination not to step on the rights of others in their climb, but rather to elevate the position of all. This attitude contrasted with their potential allies, both white women and men of color. White women suffragettes made their case for voting based on education and social status, to the exclusion of colored people. Famous white suffragette Elizabeth Cady Stanton was known to have made racist remarks, outraged by the idea that Black men might obtain the right to vote before white women. Black men were reluctant to cede their position of power as heads of the household, church, and community. Both groups wanted the support of Black women, but ignored the challenges that African-American women faced. Black feminist reformers understood that both their race and their sex affected their rights and opportunities. Black women were excluded from the 1848 Women's Convention in Seneca Falls, but were already hard at work in churches, anti-slavery societies, and women's clubs, seeking the vote to further what they termed human rights for men and women alike. They were rarely single issues in their concerns. They battled for political rights while also advocating for temperance, education, prison reform, and the rights of working people. They especially attended to troubles that arose at the crossroads of race and gender. This beautiful quote of Anna Julia Cooper sums up the cause of universal suffrage. It is not the intelligent woman versus the ignorant woman, nor the white woman versus the black, the brown, or the red. It is not even the cause of woman versus man. Nay, it is woman's strongest vindication for speaking that the world needs to hear her voice. Beginning in the 1830s and 40s, formerly enslaved women, including Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, fought for women's rights and suffrage. It was at a women's right meeting in Akron, Ohio in 1851 that Truth delivered her Ain't I a Woman speech to considerable opposition to her position. If the first woman turned the world upside down, these women together ought to be able to turn it back, and the men better let them. Sarah Raymond won acclaim at the 1858 National Women's Rights Convention in New York City by saying, "The free colored people of the North States are of no crime, but merely the fact of complexion, deprived of all political and social rights. Whatever wealth or eminence in intellect or refinement they may attain, they are treated as outcasts." Individual white suffragists openly campaigned against the 15th Amendment, allowing Black men to vote. But it was passed in 1869 with support from Black suffragists like Mary Church Terrell, counting on their support in return. For an intelligent colored man to oppose women's suffrage is the most preposterous and ridiculous thing in the world. In 1869, Louisa Rowland courageously proclaimed her support for universal suffrage on the floor of the South Carolina House of Representatives. She and her four sisters, Frances, Catherine, Lottie, and Florence, were prominent in women's suffrage campaigns at the local and national levels. We ask suffrage not as a favor, not as a privilege, but as a right, based on the grounds that we are human beings and as such entitled to all human rights. We claim that public opinion has had a tendency to limit women's sphere to too small a circle. And until woman has the right to representation, this will last, and other rights will be held by insecure tenure. Abolitionist Mary Ann Shadd Cary was the first Black American female publisher, attempted to vote in Washington, D.C. in 1871. She was prevented from casting a ballot, but she insisted upon an affidavit recognizing her attempt. A tireless writer, publisher, and reformer, Shadd Cary became the second Black female lawyer at the age of 60. She wrote to encourage hardworking souls, "It is better to wear out than to rust out." In a speech delivered at the 1873 convention, Black suffragist Frances Ellen Watkins Harper shared her view that women of color should not be excluded from American suffrage. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. Her sentiments were echoed by Adela Logan Hunt, who wrote in 1912, "If white American women, with all their natural and acquired advantages, need the ballot, how much more do Black Americans, male and female, need the strong defense of a vote to help secure their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Nannie Helen Burroughs wrote in a 1915 essay that when the ballot is put into the hands of the American woman, the world is going to get a correct estimation of the Negro woman. It will find her a tower of strength, of which poets have never sung, orators have never spoken, and scholars have never written. And that women need the ballot to reckon with men who place no value upon her virtue and to mold healthy public sentiment in favor of her own protection. Ida B. Wells Barnett organized the Chicago-based Alpha Suffrage Club in 1913. Born into slavery and orphaned at age 16, Wells was a crusader for social justice of all types. The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. The 19th Amendment was passed in June of 1919 and ratified in August of 1920. By that time, 20 states had already granted women the ballot. This amendment was hardly cause for celebration for Wells. She wrote in 1921, "Under the authority of a national law that gave every citizen the right to vote, the newly made citizens chose to exercise their suffrage. But the reign of the national law was short-lived and illusionary. Hardly had the sentences dried upon the statute books before one Southern state after another raised the cry against Negro domination and proclaimed that there was an unwritten law that justified any means to resist it." Holly Quinn Brown was another activist that was not able to rest as Jim Crow laws still prevented many from voting, with poll taxes, literacy tests, and more. In 1926, she urged society to cleave more tenaciously to the truth and to battle more heroically for the right. Other women of color were relying on these newly minted voters to support their own causes of enfranchisement. Zitkala Saw, a member of the Dakota Nation, writer, opera composer, and reformer for Native opportunities and cultural preservation, wrote in 1920, "Now the time is at hand when the American Indian shall have his day through the help of the women of America." Native women would not be able to vote until 1957. In 1913, when she was just a teenager, Mabel Ping Hua Li, a Chinese immigrant, led a parade of 10,000 through the streets of New York. She wrote that true feminism is nothing more than the extension of democracy or social justice and equality of opportunities to women. She was denied the vote, even after the 19th Amendment was ratified, by the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese Americans were finally granted the vote in 1946 with the passage of the Magnuson Act. For Black women, especially in Southern states, the struggle for the vote extended for decades more to 1965, when the Voting Rights Act would finally topple barriers constructed by Jim Crow. This act represented more than a century of work by Black women to make voting easier and more equitable. Latino women and men would have to wait 10 years more for an extension of the Voting Rights Act to include those with language barriers before they could vote without restrictions. Jovita Idar was a Mexican-American journalist that single-handedly protected her Mexican newspaper headquarters when the Texas Rangers came to shut it down. In 1911, she advocated for women's education and suffrage and is known for writing, "When you educate a woman, you educate a family." The 19th Amendment, like the 15th Amendment, sadly did not remake the Constitution into a guarantor of voting rights. It is true that the amendment references such a right. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied, but that mention is an illusion. There is no fixed reference point in the Constitution. The United States is, in fact, one of the few constitutional democracies that extends no such right in its governing charter. States, not the federal government, appoint voters. Millions of women were already voting before 1920. And because what women technically won was only non-discrimination in voting on the basis of sex, millions of women still could not vote after 1920. Given this, we cannot pinpoint a single date when women won the vote, reflecting just how localized voter governance is in the United States. After 1920, court cases, federal laws, and 2 more constitutional amendments, barring poll taxes and lowering the voting age, have continued to stop disenfranchisement, but none of these federal measures have assured Americans of a right to vote. Securing that right remains the unfinished work of this hard-fought historical legacy. And so a call to action, in the words of Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, if laws are unjust, they must be continually broken until they are altered.